Welcome to Unit 11 of the Technology, Innovation, and the Civil War series. I'm Dr. Nick Sambaluk. The U.S. Quartermaster's Department, which we first mentioned in Unit 5, spent $1 billion during the war, supplying the Union's several large armies. Historically, the United States government had been small, and its sources of income had been small as well. This was largely because Americans preferred a small government that maximized the agency and the options of individual stakeholders, those who could vote and participate in society in an official economic and social sense. The federal government was funded by selling Western lands at very cheap prices and by imposing tariffs. Tariffs are protective taxes, imposing tariffs on various imported goods. Tariff issues were controversial in U.S. history because they protected some U.S. manufacturers while inevitably endangering other U.S. producers with the possibility of foreign reciprocal tariffs. If you raise your tariff to protect your own domestic manufacturers, what do the foreign countries do? They likely retaliate with tariffs to protect some of their producers in areas where they might otherwise be undercut by your own exported products. So, sales of lands in the West and tariffs. But wars cost big money. Even before Bull Run, it was obvious to planners both in the North and in the South that tariffs would not pay the bills for even a short conflict. National debt, threatened to shackle a country to interest payments, then as today, literally mortgaging the future of the country. So this was certainly a danger. But how could the large costs of war be covered in the near term without somehow raising or fronting more money? The Union introduced a temporary federal income tax in August 1861, and they adjusted the rates in the middle of 1862 and again in 1864. Even at its peak, the top tier rate, the highest rate was 10%, and that was on incomes of over $10,000 annually, at a time when that was a phenomenally large income. A reasonably well employed laborer with some training, some skills, might expect to make something on the order of $400 or $500 perhaps in a year. So the top tier income tax rate is 10% on incomes of over $10,000. The Confederacy reluctantly introduced a tax on real and personal property. And that's different from an income tax. A property tax is something, of course, that hits everything you own, not just what you're making this particular year. So the Confederate property tax, real and personal property tax rate, was 1/2 of 1%. And furthermore, it exempted land, and it exempted slaves. Now, this is fascinating and really a pretty phenomenal policy move on the part of the Confederacy. its exemption of land and slaves, in effect, um, made Confederate tax codes both ineffective at raising cash and absolutely saddled the poorer majority of Southerners with an enormously disproportionate amount of the tax burden. Since the South's economic elites had mostly committed their money to slaves and land. And what are the two main exemptions to the real property tax? Land and slaves. This also, incidentally, robs the Confederate property tax policy of its main theoretical opportunity to garner money for the war effort. So a rather strikingly surprising and very significant fiscal policy on the part of the Confederate States. There were other methods attempted. Both the Union and the Confederacy tried to sell war bonds, but neither was able to really find very many initial buyers. The Confederacy began to sell bonds in exchange for money, but then also in exchange for crops, and eventually in exchange for the promise of crops that had not yet been grown. The federal government, meanwhile, the Union, tried to force banks in the United States to buy bonds. These are non-interest bearing bonds. And the federal government was attempting to force banks in the Union to buy non-interest bearing bonds in exchange for gold-backed currency. Not surprisingly, the federal government found very few banks that were interested in this rather bad idea. Quite a bad deal financially, because it would limit their credit reserves, and it would actually have contracted the United States economy. It would have made the economy smaller during wartime, which is really the exact opposite effect than what you would want to have as you're trying to gear a country up for a war effort. Fortunately, a group of bankers and businessmen persuaded Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase and a majority in Congress to change tactics in fiscal terms. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 made the federal bonds acceptable currency for any purpose except customs duties and interest on bonds. These two exceptions mattered a great deal. The first exception ensured that tariffs, remember, tariffs are the traditional means of federal income and have been the traditional means of federal income for the entire history of the Republic thus far. Tariffs will still arrive in the form of hard currency because these bonds can't be used to pay tariffs off. The second exemption reassured bondholders that they would be paid interest on their bonds and that the interest would be in money that was known to be worth something. Although the Civil War was extremely expensive for both sides, the Union created ways to cover the costs of war, and the Confederacy did not. The results could be seen on the battlefield. As Union troops remained fed, and as the war continued, they remained relatively well equipped, and in many cases, in real terms, they became better equipped during the war. While in contrast, Confederate soldiers in Confederate armies grew hungrier, with less food in their haversacks and less ammo in their cartridge cases. For the first 2 years of the war, the Union relied on volunteers to fill the Army's ranks. When the president called for volunteers, each state was assigned a quota of troops, a quota to raise. The states held rallies then until their share had been recruited. And often this was spread so that a state's quota was then distributed amongst the counties appropriately by guesstimate to the populations. The cities would have their quotas. Some of the rural counties would have their own quotas as well, and they'd come up with the state quota, which would then contribute to the federal total. The Union's two most populous states were New York, with 4 million people, and Pennsylvania, with 3 million. These two states together nearly matched the Confederacy's combined population of 9.1 million. If you took just New York and Pennsylvania, you would come to something that is rather close to the total population of the entire Confederacy. Much of the enlistment burden, therefore, rested on New York and Pennsylvania. The other states were certainly involved, but these two states, New York and Pennsylvania, were very, very large contributors to the Union armies, as you'll notice from the rosters, the orders of battle of forces like the Army of Potomac. Although the U.S. had many young men, enlistment enthusiasm began to flag quite quickly, even in stridently Republican, pro-Union Pennsylvania. The war effort required more than soldiers. It required food, it required equipment, and tools, and weapons, and many rural Pennsylvanians, especially fathers, were assured that staying home to feed the army was a vital element of patriotism. These men were frustrated by chronic calls for more volunteers. The U.S. draft took effect on March 3, 1863, 11 months after the Confederacy had begun its draft. The Union draft accounted for less than 5% of the total Union manpower in its armies. Meanwhile, states offered bounties or bonuses to people willing to sign up as soldiers. Bounties of $100, $200, and eventually $300 per soldier went to volunteers. For $300, and again, that's most of what an average sort of middle-class worker might earn in a year. For $300, a man could be exempted from one draft call, although he would be still eligible for a future draft call. In 1864, the commutation term was set at a year, just standardizations that people would understand what they were buying. For about $1,100, a man might hire a substitute to voluntarily serve in his place. This would bring permanent excused status from the draft. In at least a few instances, enlisted companies were set up in New York City to send agents to England. These agents recruited laborers to come to America and serve as military substitutes. This was a scam. It was illicit. It was uncovered in the second half of 1864, and it might have sparked an Anglo-American political crisis. But the late phase of the war and large-scale Anglo-American commerce largely averted any kind of serious international flare-up. Although bounties were awarded in large numbers, substitutes and conscripts were supplemental addendums to the Union's manpower rather than its major reservoirs for personnel in the latter phases of the war. The vast majority of Union soldiers remained volunteers, in distinct contrast to the case with the Confederacy for the last half of the war. The question for this week is how and why did U.S. conscription differ from its Confederate counterpart? Next time, we'll look at the telegraph, railroads, and repeaters.